let me start with thanking you all for being here tonight. It's a pleasure being here and talking about my book with such engaged audience. It's truly a pleasure and honor for me to be here tonight. Okay. Let me just set a timer for myself because I tend to go over time. So, okay. The book that I'm going to talk about today, The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry, Politics of Poetic Experimentation, is writing this book and doing this research actually for me was beyond the regular research. It was about my own journey as a poet, asking myself if what I write as a poet matters. To find out, I delved into the works of past poets who challenged the norms in modern Persian poetry. I wanted to tell the stories of poets who were often overlooked from a different perspective. So I went to a transformative journey. At the same time as I was writing this book, I actually wrote a long poem, which I like to call a verse essay, which I consider as a poetic version of this research, which is called شعر بلند شرایط, or the long poem of consequences or circumstances, if you want to translate that, which was published in 2019 in Iran. Like in the book talks that I had for this book, I always start with a piece of that long poem. I choose different ones though. This one, I haven't read this one yet anywhere. So it's somehow related to this section of the book that I'm going to talk about today. So I just read the Persian text, and you probably can see the English version on the side, I hope. Okay. نوشته‌ای توی گذرنامه چی نوشته فرستاده، توی نامه از چی گذر داده، در سرای گیت در خانه خیشی، خیش خانه درویش و برادر بزن. گذرنامه معنای نامه دارد، گذرنامه را اصل نامه است که یک شبی با هم نوشتیمش. بنویس یا اصلا این شعر را اینطور شروع کن: یغما سلام سلام یغما، یعنی سلام مخاطب خاص. اکبر را فرستادیم پی عروض، پی حروف قافیه برش گرداندند، برش گرداندیم شهیدش کردند. شعری مشترک نوشتیم با بعضی نفرات، خوب نشد، برش که گرداندیم شهیدش کردند. قافیه هاش را دست مالی کرده بودند و برش گرداندند. اگر به من بود این نوحه از اینجا شروع می شد. اگر چه نوحه خودش دارد برای حفظ قافیه می جنگد. چراغ ها را خاموش می کنم، دارم برای اکبر می گریم، دارم برای دوتا چشم، دارم برای یک شعر بلند محفوظ در نواری کوچک که کمی از من در خود دارد و کمی از دوستم و برخی از شاعران آن شعر مشترک در آن شب بی معنی. دارم میگریم، سینه میزنم و میگریم اکبر. دست من ای زن من ای قلمم، ترس من اکبر من. تو بلیغی تو شهیدی تو بعیدی، قلمم اکبر من. اکبرم از قلم ترس سیاه شد مژه‌هاش، یاد داری که صداش. تو مرو یشم به چشمت که هبا شد وطنم، داشت زنگید خراش. اره دندانه به تألیف من انداخته بود، شعر پرداخته بود. شعرا شعر سرودند و زبان شد و حلم، جنگم انداخته بود. دست انداخت کمر داغ شد و شعر شهید، کس صدایی نشنید. خون و خانه زن و دندانه صدا شد کفنم، شعر از دست کشید. ببر با قافیه در بستر و من در بر ببر، در چله با سر صبر. میش با چشم تو یشمانده شمایل شمنم، سطر در مخزن ابر. آری این رنگ ز هجرت به ابد در کلمه است، پشتم از دست ببست کل و ارزن کلمه، وا کلماتم دهنم چشم تو رنگ شکست. چراغ را روشن کنید و پس بر سر تاریخ باز شوید. چراغ را روشن می کنم و پس بر سر تاریخ باز می شوم. کمی شعر می کنم و پس بر سر تاریخ باز می شوم. نوشته ای شعر اسم نیست، شعر کردن فعل مرکبی است که خون می خواهد. داده بودیم به اکبر ببرد، برش گرداندند. شعر کردن فعل مرکبی است که در سطر آخر این شعر و شعر بعدی و همان شعر مشترک در آن شب بی‌معنی باید تکرار می شده باشد. شعر کردن فعل مرکبی است که تهران می خواهد و دارد و با پدری به کسوت یک بمب همه را دور هم جمع می کند و با پدری به کسوت یک بحر همه را در یک مصرع جمع می کند. از مرگ شاعر جوانی که برادر این سطر است زجه می کند و نوحه می خواند که خواندیم. Let me start with a few words about the book and then focus on one of the poets that is discussed actually in the first chapter of the book, Yaghma Jandaqi. Persian poetry hasn't evolved in a straightforward manner. Since the 1800s, various periods has brought forth numerous poets and movements, each contributing to a unique facet of the literary landscape. However, these voices were often overlooked or pushed aside by the mainstream. This had resulted in the history of modern Persian poetry that features multiple parallel and mutually influential movements, engaging in the polemical dialectics between the more dominant trends. Scholars typically depict the evolution of Iranian literature as a gradual departure from traditional aesthetics toward modernization. The shift is often seen as a response to the social and political changes of the mid-19th century, meeting the cultural demands of the time. Yet, mainstream accounts frequently ignore or marginalize the critical role of alternative poets, who, by experimenting with the new aesthetics, significantly contributed to what is now termed the literary revolution. Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq, in his celebrated work Recasting Persian Poetry, contends that the mainstream disregarded for these alternative poets, the disregard of this mainstream is only natural. He argues that whenever new poetic forms arise, they risk being dismissed as non-poetry or nonsense, because readers may struggle to understand them as the poets intended. According to Karimi Haqqaq, the failure of these works to resonate with audiences stem from their departure from traditional methods of creating aesthetic pleasure, leading critics to basically sideline them. This book aims to address this gap by re-examining the roles of these poets and their unconventional experiments throughout the aesthetic revolution in modern Persian poetry. Basically, the idea here is that I try to, I think what is established in the historiography of modern Persian poetry is that we had this political crisis, we had these major political events, and because of those events, Persian poetry has changed to adopt itself, basically, with the trends. The idea of this book is that looking at these changes from a different perspective and see how these changes in poetry has influenced political and social changes in the society. And it's not only by the content of these poems. I try to argue that how changes in the form and experimentations with the established forms of Persian poetry has changed the mindset of the readers and actually allowed them to think about the socio-political conditions differently. The research aims to closely examine various aspects of aesthetic revolution and challenge the prevailing assumptions found in current studies of modern Persian poetry. In Recasting Persian Poetry, Karimeh Haqqaq discusses the transition from Qa'ani, a prominent figure in classical poetry of the 19th century, to Nima Yushij, considered as the founder of the modern Persian poetry. However, Karimeh Haqqaq's arguments are based on the dominant narrative that views mainstream modernist trend as the only natural alternative to classical Persian poetry. He suggests exploring abandoned visions and unsuccessful efforts as supplements to the main story. Yet, I contend against marginalizing alternative poetic movements in mainstream narratives. Instead, I argue that these movements, whether collectively or individually, run parallel to the mainstream of their aesthetic, and their aesthetic experiments played a significant role in shaping literary change. In a sense, this study challenges mainstream literary histories by shedding light on the overlooked journey of alternative poems, connecting figures like Yaghma Jandaqi instead of Qa'ani to Hushang Irani and Tundar Kiya instead of Nima Yushij. And it's not like trying to create this shadow canon. It's basically trying to show what's their role in the whole literary revolution. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I am actually currently trying to replace these people in the new book that I'm writing, which is called The Worst Persian Poems, a Shadow Canon, where I am basically working on what is considered as bad poetry in the history of modern, classical and modern Persian poetry. So, which is another topic. Therefore, this book rewrites the narrative of modern Persian poetry by exploring how aesthetic shifts intertwine with resistance against political and cultural control. To develop this idea, it categorizes the history of alternative poetry into 4 periods: literary return movement, constitutional revolutionary poetry, post-constitutional poetry, and finally the domination of modernism. It also analyzes the aesthetic, cultural, and political aspect of the works of a selected group of alternative poets from the early 19th to the mid-20th century. By alternative poets, it would be much easier if I call them collectively avant-garde poets, but because of this, because I started from the 1800s, it's a little, it's a stretch to call Yaghma Jandaqi an avant-garde by basically the definition that we have from avant-garde and an avant-garde artist. So I chose the term alternative poets as in to basically show how they could act as an alternative to the main current, to the mainstream of the literary movements at their time. The works analyzed in this book's chapters are selected to highlight the pioneering experiments of various movements and individuals in each period under consideration. These experiments hold significance in 2 key ways. Firstly, they influenced the course of poetic modernization in ways distinct from more moderate reformist movements. Secondly, they offered alternative pathways for aesthetically innovative poems to interact with social reality and ultimately oppose political and cultural dominance. Each chapter of this book meticulously examines the formal characteristics of the selected poems, revealing their corrective stance toward the prevailing literary norms and established poetic traditions. It demonstrates how the unique experimentation found in the works of these movements or individual poets influenced subsequent generations of Persian poetry. During the Constitutional Revolution era, pioneer poets utilized performative elements from religious and folklore art forms to amplify the voices of the marginalized. This experience fostered the concept of poetic revolution through the integration of colloquialism and diverse genres. Subsequently, debates surrounding the new notion of poetic evolution among the next generation of poets in the post-constitutional period promoted pioneer poets to move beyond merely incorporating topical themes, delving into more radical experimentations with formal properties. Finally, the achievements of these experiments were further developed by both experimentalist and avant-garde poets during the dominance of modernism in Persian poetry. If you take a look at the table of content of this book, there are several very well-known poets listed there, like Malik al-Shu'ara Bahar, Mirzadeh Ishqi, and Arif Ghazvini, later Abul Qasim al-Lahuti. But I try to go for the poems by these poets which were not studied before, or not well studied at least, because they were not considered as the main works of these poets, because they are basically out of scope. They are a little bit more different from what they did, what their main body of their work was. But I believe that those were the experiments that they meant to do, and they were very, very influential in the next generation of marginalized and alternative poets rather than the mainstream of the literary modernization. In each section, the analysis begins by examining specific experiments in formal features, then transitions to critical discussions about the concept of literary change and its connection to various forms of resistance against political and cultural dominance. This approach equips the research with the theoretical tools needed to resurrect overlooked practices of alternative Persian poetry over the past century, and ultimately reconstruct the narrative of poetic evolution in modern Iran. Additionally, brief biographical sketches of selected poets have been incorporated into each chapter to enhance our understanding of the circumstances and motivations driving their particular experimental approaches. So I basically, theoretically speaking, by engaging in the political scene and influencing the political scene, I try to go beyond the content of these poems and how they reflect on political events by examining how their changes and experimentations with formal features of the poem can be seen as a political act. So I use the Ronstier's Poetics of Literature idea to show that how any experimental, any avant-garde movements within a form can be seen as a political act because of a deep effect that it may have on the next generation of the producers of cultural products, which can in turn basically change the minds of the readers and lead them actually to thinking politically. That actually led me to the second project that I'm working on, that shadow canon, where I believe the poetry itself, the poetics itself, can be a field for political thinking. Not only reflects on political issues, but also helping the reader to think politically, not necessarily about the political event, but just creating, improving that critical mind. So based on that idea, any bad poem which basically distract you from taking some kind of aesthetic pleasure or sentimental pleasure helps you to think about how this works, how this form is changing, what is in this poem that I don't like. So it basically helps you to dislike the established ideas, established foundations in the real world out there. I delve into the transformation of literary forms as a form of rebellion against the dominance of classical poetic traditions, which often mirrored the undemocratic power dynamics of the real world. To analyze these literary movements, which can be seen as emancipatory in nature, I draw upon the insights of political philosophers like Jacques Rancière, Walter Benjamin, as well as literary theorists such as Harold Bloom, Peter Berger, Renato Poggioli. Additionally, the books benefits from the theories and poetic analysis of Iranian literary scholars such as Yahya Aryanpur, Ahmad Karimi Hakkak, Reza Baraheni, and others. In this book, I examine the works of many poets who have received limited attention, particularly among Persian scholars. Much of Iranian literary criticism focuses on mainstream trends, overlooking these lesser-known poets, such as Houshang Irani, especially, and Tondar Kiya, which I studied in the very last chapter, and also Muhammad Muqaddam Shin Parto in the 4th chapter. Therefore, I adopt a broader transcultural approach, especially in these last chapters, viewing these poems not merely as local products, but within the broader context of world literature. I try to show that this basically preassumption that any major change in the modern era was somehow related or copied from its Western counterparts and Western versions of it, how we should see that as a transcultural phenomenon, and basically analyze those poems as a dialogue between these avant-garde movements in that region, in Iran, and like Persian-speaking world, and their basically Western counterparts. Through that, I try to analyze that using post-colonial ideas, which is not the topic of this talk today. Let me skip a few sections. Sorry, I'm checking the time. Okay, so already late. During the 18th and 19th centuries, shifts in poetic styles and themes emerged, diverging from the ideas of literary return movements. Some poets of the era sought to engage with contemporary issues, notably the socio-political turmoil of the Qajar period, marking an early inclination towards poetry advocating for social change. While these poems may not encapsulate modern notions of social progression and freedom, they serve as precursors of the groundbreaking poetry of the 1905 to 1911 Iranian Constitutional Revolution. The socio-political poetry preceding the revolution, regardless of its stance on prevailing crisis, laid the groundwork for subsequent generation commitment to social issues. However, the primary concern of this talk is to show how these committed poems contributed to a trend of modernization and reformulation of poetic forms in Persian poetry. This is basically the first person that is discussed in this book. I also published an article about Yaghma Jandaqi in which I explored his work in length, and it was published in a edited volume by Professor Homa Katuzian in, I think, 2020 or 21, and where I basically explored this idea a little, probably better in basically longer article. I'm happy to share the link to that article as well later with anyone who is interested. Well, Yaghma Jandaqi, who has been from a lower class family and have had several conflicts with authorities during his life, tried to portray himself as a figure who resists against the injustice and corruption of his time. Although he comprehended the crisis of his time deeply, lack of the discourse of social resistance did not allow him to go further than attacking local rulers and lower-level officials. However, Yaghma's poetry contains the hidden language of the subordinate people, suppressed by the common public language promoted by the hierarchical powers. Therefore, raising the hidden language against the public, one might be Yaghma's motivation to creating innovative poetic forms. The more a poet internalizes the crisis, the more innovative his poetic form could be. Yaghma's internalized anger illustrates itself as an unconventional form in his satirical works and his resistance against the hierarchy of literary subjects, which in turn represents the hierarchy of power in society. In the book of Sardariye, a collection of satirical ghazals by Yaghma Jandaqi, he tried to use Sardar Zulfiqar Khan's rude catchphrase "Zan qahbe" in every single verse. In other words, by reflecting the harsh and implied language of Sardar Zulfiqar Khan in this book, Yaghma, probably for the first time in his career, was basically reacting to the corruption of his age. His harsh tone and using implied words are reflections to the evaluation of the subject. His ironic poetry is a dark space full of swearing and harassment, which on the one hand portrays the atmosphere of the era, and on the other hand attacks the hierarchy of values. He overturns the whole system of high-value subjects and words and replaces them with a bunch of dirty words from the streets. Nevertheless, his approach toward the poetic language does not in itself make this poem a literary work of a perfect example of the newly changed structure of poetry. But that's in the start. In contrast, خلاصة الافتضاح is an apparent attempt to structural innovation, where he has tried to use some Nohe-like, can be translated as lament, monologues during the story to move the language of narration toward the language of ordinary people. Using a built-up colloquial language and the templates of Nohe during a long Taziyeh, like passion play, narrative poetry has happened for the first time in this long poem. Nohes with colloquial language, different arrangements of rhyme, and prosodic patterns is one of the earliest attempts to break the monotony of classical Persian poetry. Nohes play the role of breaks between different parts of the narration and engage the reader with the poem as a performance. The content of the poem is also in line with the figure of Yaghma as a poet of resistance, where the poet for the first time in his age portrays a conflict between two different social classes without hiding them under the veil of metaphors and symbols. The story is set in Kashan, and that's a real story, by the way, from the time that Yaghma was an official in Kashan, and describes a big party at which an attack is carried out by a group of bondwomen, or kanizane, this higher class family. In this poem, Yaghma attempts to illustrate the violence of the lower class group, the bondwoman, against an upper class group of men. That basically the story is this: bondwomen attack this party and capture and torture these men of leisure. So it's very controversial for the time. The bondwomen assault these drunken and affluent men and beat them because of their suffering at the hands of a social class consisting of men of leisure. Although Yaghma does not evaluate any of these groups and does not try to show the bondwomen as revolutionaries, he recreates a resurrection like situation in which subalterns take revenge of their masters, a condition that subalterns find a distinctive voice to face the higher class uncensored and directly. As James C. Scott states in his book Domination and the Art of Resistance, every subordinate group creates a hidden transcript representing a critic of power, spoken when proponents of the dominant rule are absent. That is to say, every social class and even every particular group has a certain type of language to face the dominant rule, although this language is comprehensive only among the members of that group. For instance, in their private meeting or their conversations with their families, co-workers, or friends, people from lower level of power criticize their employers or their masters who are from upper level of power. In moments of crisis, or when these subordinate groups are under pressure, this language may become aggressive and radical. However, they are more careful and more considerate of their masters' positions when facing them directly. The idea here is that what Yaghma Jandaqi has written is not a revolutionary text per se, but because Yaghma tries to make that hidden transcript public, that's an act of revolution. Because revolutions basically happen when you find the courage to reveal whatever is hidden, just into the face of the power. So he tries to recreate those revolutionary movements and moments in his work more than anything. He also argues that, Scott argues that the ruling class in turn develops another hidden transcript to represent the practices and claims of their rule, and this cannot be openly avowed. In other words, securing information about the details of rulers' practices and maintaining the gap between upper and lower class in terms of power, the ruling class establishes an internal hidden transcript among themselves. Scott demonstrates how a comparison of the hidden transcript of the subordinate with that of the masters, the two hidden transcripts with the public transcript, offers a new way of understanding the resistance to domination. By public transcript, he means basically that general manner and behavior that all classes have and show in the presence of each other. So basically what is out there, what is, in terms of literature, that might be called the formal language for the literature, what is acceptable, what is teachable, what you can include in the canon of literature. And that is why I tend to call these works, Yaghma's works especially, a shadow canon, something that is created and not to be publicly distributed, not to be just shown to everybody. It's something to be read and to be practiced basically in a closer group among people of a certain social class. In looking at Yaghma's career, one can identify two separate types of work. The first is that the poems that are not eulogy qasidas, proffered to powerful governors or their relatives, but are instead neutral about ruling class cruelty. So he never actually composed any traditional qasida where he praises a higher level person. These can be interpreted as poems that represent the public transcripts among the ruling class and the people who were in the lower level of the state hierarchy. This is the level at which poets who were related to the court were supposed to use a certain language to eulogize royalty, the rulers, and the military commanders. However, as seen in some of Yaghma's poems, which were produced at the time as the above, the Khulasatul Iftizah, and in his letters to his sons and relatives, when he was away from the centers of power, because we know that he was, at the time, he was working basically at the court and he would receive salaries from the court, Qajar court, but he basically moved away and tried to not be engaged with the court anymore after a while. So in those letters and in those poems from that era, in that period, Yaghma and his counterparts produced texts that criticized the current socio-political situation. There is another very, very important period in Yaghma's life when he was working with a group of intellectuals of his time, and they basically shaped a group, like an underground group, Anjuman Mufakehe, like basically where they could sit together and compose poems, mostly like satirical poems, read to each other. And we have no text coming out of that sittings and meetings anyway, but I'm guessing that some of these poems, especially those that I'm going to talk about later, Asrar Mordi especially, are somehow the products of that time, where he found this community among himself, people out of the centers of the power, but still somehow related, so they try to maintain their positions as like higher class, higher level citizens, but still try to reach that language of the hidden transcript of the subordinate. Let me just skip a few sections. Okay, so not to make it too theoretical because I have fun parts too. So these structural innovations are evident in almost all types of Yaghma's poetry. But one poem in particular is ideal for illustrating how he tried to change poetry in his period. The poem is titled Asar Moradiyeh, a satirical poem about Ali Murad Khan Tuni, one of the rulers of Khorasan in Qajar era. Unfortunately, one could not find any detail about the dates and reasons for this event, or even the date of the poem's composition. However, according to Ali Al Dawood, the compiler of Yaghma's work, Ali Murad Khan, which was one of the rulers of Khorasan, it's a small part of Khorasan, attacked a caravan on its way to Jandaq and Biabanak, where Yaghma Jandaqi is from, in which Yaghma had some properties. So, personally affected by the cruelty of this specific ruler and showing himself and other ordinary people as the underdog, Yaghma composed the poem in a form that echoes that of a Taziyeh passion play. So, Asar Moradiyeh is basically a Taziyeh. The main reason behind Yaghma's interest in combining poetry and Taziyeh could be the status of this kind of performative art in society. According to Peter Shelkovsky, the late 19th and 20th and 18th and 19th century are the most important period in the growth of Taziyeh because of its popularity and the radical changes that it went through at the time. So we know that Taziyeh were mostly were basically performed during the first 10 days of the month of Muharram, and for the purpose of mourning the third Shia Imam Hussein. But it soon, at least in these 2 centuries, it soon became a kind of performance that could be played in different occasions. After the first 10 days of Muharram, even in the next month of Safar, and later in the later 1800s, it basically became kind of ritual that could happen anytime for any reason. After like someone is getting someone's conditions gets improved after a sickness, or someone comes from like a pilgrimage, or I don't know. Any other reason, basically. But at the end of the 19th century, Taziyeh was on the verge of giving birth to this modern Iranian secular theater. Based on this popularity of this form, Yaghma tried to compose a poem about the everyday problem of the time. That is basically a very, very simple issue at the time: road safety, the subject of this poem. But in this long poem, he does not have which is not religious by any means, although it's a Taziyeh and has not any reference to the Imam Hussein or any like Shi'i stories. He tries to reveal that corruption, the corruption of rulers, by basically replacing them with those historical figures, not necessarily creating metaphors as he is Yazid or he was just like Yazid or anyone, but by replacing the tone of Taziyeh and putting them in a situation where they talk like Yazid or like Shamr or anyone in that event. Although there is no Hussein or very some kind of sacred character in this work at all. So it's very, very secular and it's completely comic. Based on this popularity, Yaghma tried to compose a poem about an everyday problem of the time, that is road safety crisis, in a form which could address the people themselves. The long poem does not have a religious content, but by imitating a religious form of art, it brought the idea of revealing the corruption of the rulers among ordinary people. Asar Moradiyeh is a poem structured like a Taziyeh, in that its narrative is propelled forward by dialogue. This poem contains 503 verses, and just like a Taziyeh play, it starts with Chavush Bazshi monologue, and continues with the characters' monologues and dialogues afterwards. Ale Dawood claims that the Taziyeh play with dialogue was a controversial form of Taziyeh at this time, because basically he believes that dialogue was entered the form of Taziyeh basically during the Nasruddin Shah's time, after his trips to Europe. So he saw like theaters in the West, and then this idea basically came into the Taziyeh in Iran. Although Bahram Beyzai states that the observations of European travelers shows that even in the late Zand periods, we had Taziyeh in Iran, so, and it's most probably most of them had some kind of monologues in them. I'm just skipping a few parts because that's basically about the story of Taziyeh in this section. But the whole idea is that even if Asar Moradiyeh is not a very unique or experimental Taziyeh, bringing this form into the realm of Persian poetry is very, very innovative. At best, a Taziyeh could be considered at that time a folk performance, something that you could see on the streets or in occasions or in like someone's house or a tekiyeh or whatever. But what Yaghma does is that to recreate this form as a eligible form of poetry that can be compiled into someone's divan or collection of poems. So he's trying to change, basically bring this form into the realm of like Persian poetry, which is acceptable, teachable, canon of Persian poetry, but at the same time, makes it accessible for ordinary people who can understand this poem now with very direct references and especially the language. Even though this book may not be considered as an innovative work, let me just skip this because that's I just mentioned. One may argue that he also had the opportunity to become familiar with the Western sense of drama through travelogues written by his contemporary writers. Like Masir Talebi was published, I think, in 1813, and also Safarnameh Mirza Saleh, which is about his trips to Europe, I think, in 1815 to 1819. But again, this familiarity is not something that you can count on. It's probably he probably read some of those travelogues, but it might not be like the description of the place might not be that accurate and detailed for him to basically affect, like influence his creation, especially in this poem. Nevertheless, during Yaghma's lifetime, another type of Taziyeh, Shabih Muzhik or comic Taziyeh, was invented and evolved. This kind of comic Taziyeh probably began during the 1810s, but reached to its most successful form after the 1870s. As Sadiq Ashurpur states, this kind of Taziyeh was necessary for enhancing people's morale after 2 months of mourning. That is why they gradually started to perform some Taziyeh after the first 10 days of Muharram. These had stories about the revenge of Imam Hussein by Mukhtar and his victories. After a while, the content of these works started to change gradually. We can find a number of Taziyehs, mostly related to the second half of Fath Ali Shah's period, which are about religious characters in hilarious and even comic situations. One of the, I think, most famous ones was the one mentioned by Etemad al-Sultaneh in his memoir, which is about Fatemeh, the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, who is going to attend a wedding ceremony in Arusi, and she doesn't have proper dress. So in fact, the regular Shabih Muzhik still dealt with religious and semi-religious issues, while in this case, we encounter secular subjects in Taziyeh format. By this case, I mean Asar Moradiyeh. I'm going to read a section of آثار موردی for you so you can see how he incorporated the form of Taziyeh in his poem and also how direct it is. And just bear in mind that these people are real people. They are real names of rulers and like officials of the time living in that region, so he could be punished for what he wrote. So, and I'm going to censor myself in some sections. I hope you can see the text though. مژده دادن سفرقلی مراد را. مژده ای دزد تبس قافله تون آمد. مستعد باش که هنگام شبیخون آمد. بارشان سنجد و انقوزه و جوز است و مویز، برک و موزه و عناب و زریر و همه چیز. پای بر راه نه و بر سرشان شبخون آر، شکم ریغوی خود را ز عزا بیرون آر. خطاب مراد به سفرقلی: ایا جوان به چه منزل عبور قافله بود؟ میان تو ویشان چقدر فاصله بود؟ بگو ز عدت ایشان که بس به تشویشم، مخالفت بگذار ای بر ریشم. مباد آنکه خبر نادرست پوچ بود، نه کاروان طبس لشکر بلوچ بود. جواب سفرقلی مراد را: به ریش تو که خود اهل کاروان دیدم، چنان شدم که ز شادی به خویشتن رسیدند کنون تا حوالی تشتاب. شتر شده به چرا چشم کاروان در خواب، نهاده با برک تنگ تنگ بر سر هم، فدای ریش تو انقوزه نیست از کم. سپه بساز که اینک زمان تاراج است، کسی که با تو نیاید به دزدی اخراج است. Yaghma thus adopts a novel form of art that comes from society itself to criticize the opportunistic governors of his period, especially people of the Alif Murad Khan's type, who have used their power to pillage towns and caravans secretly. To portray the pressure on ordinary people, Yaghma uses their hidden transcripts, their own language, and the most popular form of art among them to make that hidden public. Thus, he took a popular art, Taziyeh, which was supported by Shah and the upper class, but still maintained its popular form of expression, and combined it with poetry, an elite art form, which was also popular among the people, but was mostly produced and preserved by the elites. Through this combination, he invented a dramatic form of poetry which reflected both the voices of people and the poets. This attitude toward the form shows how this poem is different from a typical satirical poem in which dialogue is also used, such as Mush o Gorbe by Obeid Zakani, basically, in the 14th century. Obeid also adopts a transgressing the standard diction of Persian poetry to make it more colloquial and attempted to create dialogues as well. However, the language in Obeid's work becomes close to ordinary people's dialects, following the traditional form of munazere, or argumentation. That means the purpose of colloquial language or dialogue is not to move the poem toward becoming a medium for ordinary people. The goal is to obey the rules of a traditional form. And in this book, in the whole arguments that I have in this book, I try to establish this idea that the traditional forms are somehow the reflection of the power dynamic in the real world. Because of this structure, the hierarchical system that the Persian poetic forms create are basically based on those relationships in the hierarchical powers. So getting away from that, like basically destroying that hierarchical system, is what makes a poet's alternative or avant-garde, in my opinion, or at least in my arguments in this book. So what basically Obaid does, it's similar to what Rumi or Nizami would do in their munazaras, basically. But Asar Moradiyeh is an experiment in order to find a new way of using colloquial language in innovative, politically charged poetry for the public folk. So again, this is about real people, and this is about like rulers in that region. The other significant difference is poems like Mush o Gorbe are basically symbolic poems. So although they are referring to real officials of the time and the real socio-political issues, but still they are, the idea is disguised under symbols and metaphors. But here in Asar Moradiyeh, Yaghma talks about and on behalf of certain governors and officials of the era. I'm skipping this section, but I just want to quickly mention that in the histories of at least drama in Iran, we encountered the name of Muhammad Ali Afrashte, a playwright, the first and second Pahlavi period, who is basically known for the first person who incorporated the form of Taziyeh into drama, like modern theater. And he has a very famous work called Taziyeh dar Bakhshdari, Taziyeh in sheriff's office, if you will, and in which the plot of this story is basically the same. So there is this sheriff who is robbing people, and he has a deputy, and there is someone who comes to like negotiate with them and somehow make them to return people's positions, but they somehow they managed to put him in the jail, which is basically the plot for Asar Moradiyeh. But the main difference is, again, these are symbolic characters and personas made up by Afrashte, although Yaghma is basically referring to real people. And so I just wanted to mention that, which is very interesting because that's basically where Afrashte gets most of his credit. And it's important to studying that section of Iranian drama to see how this kind of work could even influence Persian drama, and not only poetry at the time, like at least in modern time. Let me finish by this nohe. You probably know that Yaghma Jandaqi is most known for his nohes, a popular form usually used during the time of Muharram for mourning Imam Hussein. And it is probably, first of all, it is a performative poetic form, and it's very important in that regard. And also, it is something that is created to be shared by people, and not only shared by folk, but also asking them to participate in that performance. Most of the nohes have sections for people to repeat with the singer or madda or the person who is reciting them. I'm not going to talk about that. Just I chose this nohe to talk about the fact that using nohe and Taziyeh as the basis of his poetic forms in his political poetry, Yaghma has accepted and was influenced by the taste of ordinary people. This was also the basic point of departure in the rise of revolutionary poetry in the following generation. That's where I think his alternative work influenced the next generation of poets, whom we know as the founders of the colloquial poetry of the Constitutional Revolution. In fact, the choice enabled him to express the hidden transcript of the lower level of society because it allowed him to use a medium that was available to them. Not because, as I said earlier in this talk, that we usually assume that the changes, socio-political changes, and the rise of newspapers and journals changed the language of poetry, changed poetic forms in constitutional era. But I wanted to invite you to look from another perspective to see how the changes in these poetic forms could also create that kind of mediums. to think about if these kind of experiment didn't exist. Could we have basically newspapers that were accessible to people, or we would still use Sadi's language, which was not accessible to ordinary folk? So that's probably seeing that from another perspective. Not necessarily, I'm not trying to say necessarily one of these paths are true, but still seeing that from another angle might be helpful. So in the following nohe, composed in colloquial language and a light prosodic meter, even though the poet portrays in the event of Karbala, one may consider the content as the personal sentiment of the poet, as he does not mention any specific religious figure in here directly. Another point might be the fact that we could see strongly in the work of Arif Ghazvini in the next period, where he could basically take the poetry to the public space and share it with the audience, and basically engaging them into the creation of that work as a performance, not just poetry on paper. So I'm just going to read this for you in case you cannot see it on the slide. It says, دلم از زندگانی سخت سیره بمیرم هرچه زودتر باز دیره زنان را دل سرای درد و ماتم تن مردان نشان تیغ و تیره پسر در خون تپان دختر عزادار برادر کشته و خواهر اسیره به کام مادران لخت جگر خون به حلق کودکان خوناب شیره اسیران را به جای اشک و افغان شرر در چشم و آتش در ضمیره بدین ماتم کجا باشم شکیبا کجا زخمی چنین مرهم پذیره تو را آنان که تن در خون کشیدند الهی خاکشان با خود نگیره جهان دشمن زمین سخت آسمان دور غریب کربلا مارت بمیره. Thank you so much. I think I'm sort of on time. So I think the floor is open for questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you for your speech. First of all, I want to see what's the difference between Yaghma Jandaqi, first of all, is very well established, so it's not marginalized. Then I think, what's the difference between his poem and Hajname? We have this tradition of Hajname going back to Susan and
Of course.
because they named the official as
Yes.
well. And the other thing, I think maybe, I don't know, do you think he was influenced by Tumar and Akhalan as well? Because we had the form of dialogue and everyday language in Tumar and Akhalan, and they wrote those and they distribute these Tumars as well. And another question is, how did you choose the poems? Because, for example, during the Constitutional Revolution, there were like many popular poems, such as Naranjak by Vahid Dastgirdi, which is now very like forgotten. And then like, why did we read another poem by Bahar when we have all of these like other poets? And where are women in your work? For example, like we know that Shamsi Kasmai started breaking all the verses and the like formal structure of Persian poems. So thank you.
Thank you so much for all these amazing questions. Well, let me start with the difference between what Yaghma, well, let me start with the idea that Yaghma is an established poet. Yaghma is an established Nohe creator. So we know him for his religious work and satirical ghazals, Sardariye. Interestingly enough, Asar Moradiyeh and Khulasat al-Iftizah are not included in his divan. So the idea is that in later generations, people did not see these kind of forms as eligible to be included in a proper classical poetry collection. So we have two Yaghmas. an experimentalist Yaghma, and established return movement poet Yaghma. I tried to focus on experimentalist Yaghma, where he tried to basically combine these forms to reach to something new. And it's very important, and I chose the works that I consider as performative, because this is a very important move when you see the trend of modernization in Persian poetry. Mirzadeh Ishqi, Nima Yushij, later Tonder Kia, who we know as the founders of the modern Persian poetry, they all tried to create dramatic poems, which they called sometimes drama. Nima did call Afsane drama. Mirzadeh Ishqi called Setablo Maryam drama. So it is very important to see what are the first experiments in this matter to dramatize poetry as a way of expanding the genre, to make it political, basically, not the content-wise, but make it accessible for political thinking and criticism. That's the thing about the Yaghma as an established poet and avant-garde poet. The difference of these poems with Hajv is that Hajviyeh is basically created in known poetic forms. So you do not deal with experimentations in form when you are reading in Hajviyeh by Suzani Samarkandi, for instance. But in Yaghma, whenever he's trying to create such content, he's trying to experiment with forms as well. One of his very, very important poems, which are not included in his divan and is published just once by his grandson in Yaghma journal, I think in the 1950s, probably late 1950s, is a poem called Sayyid Aboud, which has a very, very interesting story. Sayyid Aboud is a poem that Yaghma created on behalf of his friend, Hossein Jandaqi, who was attacked by an official, and basically all his belongings were captured, and like he was fired from his job as an accountant or something. So he asked Yaghma Jandaqi to write an Hajviyeh to mock that person, that official. That's the story. Hossein Jandaqi himself was a poet. According to Yaghma Jandaqi, in a letter to his son, he was a very bad poet. So he is writing a poem on behalf of Hossein. What he does is that he writes a bad poem. So he writes a poem with uneven lines, like very similar to Nimai form, and he brings in colloquial language, and he swears, and it's a terrible poem. And within that, he creates a Hajviyeh on behalf of Hossein. So even in that case, when he received this basically like Sefarish Geref, basically like he was ordered to do that, he experimented with form. That's the important thing about Yaghma. It makes it different with others. I want to just connect this with your another question about why I chose a lesser known poem from Bahar, rather than going towards like some other experimentations, for instance, from Dastgirdi, Vaid Dastgirdi. It was because I can see this two different artist character in Bahar as well. We have a Bahar who has very political work in which he talks about politics. He leads people. His poetry is chanted onto streets. And we have basically documents showing that people were singing Bahar's songs on the streets of Mashhad after the victory of the revolution. So it's huge. But we have another Bahar, that's political, but we have another Bahar who tries to be political by changing the form, the hierarchical structure of Persian poetry, Persian poetics, basically. He tries to experiment somehow to break free from what was basically dictated to him as proper form, as proper poetry. That's the Bahar that I wanted to talk about in this book. Also about Raf'at, there is the same case, Abul Qasim al-Lahuti. Most of these poets have established works, but they are usually not experimental in form per se. I went to this route to find the poems that are not read enough, I think, and by reading them, we may be able to reimagine parallel lines and movements to the modernization of Persian poetry. About Tumar Naqalan, that's a very, very interesting, actually, reference that you are making. It's totally relevant. Now I wish I included them, but it's from the same nature. It's something that is shared by public, and it's not just like reading to them. It's an invitation to participate, like creating a participatory kind of poetry, which is not a formal Persian poetry that we know, something that is written, something that is on the paper. So it's very relevant. Yeah, that's from, it comes from the same idea, I guess. Did I cover everything? Oh, about the women. I wish I could write more, but unfortunately in this period, there are no other experimentalist women poets. I wanted to focus on experimentalists. And Shamsi Kasmai is probably the only one. And even Shamsi Kasmai, we don't have access to to her works. It's just a few works being published here and there. It doesn't give us much to analyze. But in this second book that I'm writing right now, Bad Poems, the Worst Poems of Persian Poetry, there are a lot of women poets, actually, that can be discussed. And the way that they think about poetics and poetic form, which is completely, actually that's I'm a little, I don't want to say crazy, but not normal in this matter. One of the main theories in this book was Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence. The second book is written by, actually written based on this idea that is against anxiety of influence. That's basically centered around the anxiety of authorship, which is a feminist read of Bloom's ideas. So there you will see more women. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much. That was great. I'm excited about reading the book.
Okay.
So I've got two questions for you. The first question is about your introduction. Actually, you place a lot of emphasis on political events as the primary force driving changes in Persian poetry. How do you view the influence of non-political factors? I mean, you mentioned actually cultural effects, but it's not clear what you mean exactly by the word culture. And my second question is about the way that you conceptualize actually formal conception of this concept of Taziyeh as a form.
Mm-hmm.
Is Taziyeh actually defined more by its form or its content? I mean, if you change the content, does it remain Taziyeh? It's deeply intertwined to with religion. It's a religious concept. Can be, as you said, can be this Taziyeh by changing its content secular.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. Very interesting question. Let me start with the second question. Yes, if you take the content away from a Taziyeh, it's not Taziyeh anymore. That's exactly what happens here. He took away the content, so it's not Taziyeh, it's a poem now. That's something that you read on the paper and you think about that. It's not something that, it's not a sentimental thing to make you cry or mourn for a religious person. But a very important point here is that, in my view, poetry is all about placement. It's all about topology. If you see, I think that's Terry Gilton's example. If you see a sign saying, "Do not walk your dog here," in a park, that's a sign that shows that you are not allowed to walk your dog there. But if you see that very sign on a piece of paper in a book, it becomes poetry. That's all about placement. That's all about changing the direction of our perspective. That's about basically making it uncomfortable and not regular, not normal. What Yaghma does with Taziyeh form is the same thing. He takes Taziyeh, or Shabih Moshek even, like comic Taziyeh, and bring it in another realm. Present it as a poem. That's where the poetry happens, basically, regardless of what the quality is, what the content is, how successful this experiment is. That's the important thing about Yaghma. Yaghma is writing all this in 1850s. So it's like at least 5-6 decades before the first experiments that we know for like constitutional revolutionary poetry. So experimenting with all this is sort of regular language for us now because we have seen Nasim Shomal, we have seen Arif Ghazvini, we have seen Mirzadeh Ishqi long after him. But writing this at that time, it's really something. It's very different and unconventional. So that's about topology of the text, I think. Regarding your first question, yeah, I try to I try to not to focus on political events as turning points in the history of modern Persian poetry. Instead, looking at differently and putting turning points in the process of modernization of Persian poetry as the basically milestones in this history. If you remember, I started with like the first period is the return movement period, not pre-revolutionary period or something like that. Even the references to constitutional revolution or their periods are called constitutional poetry. And it's defined by the changes into the poetics of the time, not necessarily what's going on out there, which is, there are overlaps because of this two-way relationship, basically, between these two, that dialogue. Although I know it's not possible because it's such a political era, and all these poems are somehow political, content or form-wise, anyway. But I try to emphasize on those changes into not poetry in general, even in the forms of modern Persian poetry. Thank you. Sure.
You know, on the question of Taziyeh and Shabih, Professor Beitzain has a theory, I'm sure you read it, where he says essentially Taziyeh, Shabih, and Takht-i-Hawzi are all from the same source.
Yeah.
So what Jandaqi is doing is essentially going back to the origins.
Exactly.
And discovering the commonality between Takht-i-Hawzi, which is a comic play, and Taziyeh. Islam usurps a form that was joyous and turns it into grief.
Exactly.
He is returning the favor.
Exactly. Yeah, that's just very interesting read. Yeah, also there is this Jung Shahadat that we know was existing in Fath Ali Shah's court. We don't have access to the text now, but it apparently consists of dozens of Taziyeh. That's probably one of the first written Taziyeh collections. We don't have access to it anymore, but it actually, because he probably had access to it when he was working in the Muhammad Shah's court. That probably might be one of the resources that he used to do what you're mentioning, like going through them, trying to understand the form. And that's interesting to know that he never composed a Taziyeh, at least as we know, like a regular Taziyeh. He has no hymn, but he doesn't have Taziyeh. The only Taziyeh that he created was these comic, political, Taziyeh-like poems. So it probably proves your point that that was kind of a research project for him, understanding that and creating something. And that's actually very interesting about Yaghma. What Yaghma writes is not just a poem aesthetically pleasing, it's basically a verse essay. It's something that there are theories involved, there are a history of literature involved in what he does. Understanding his poetry is not about understanding what he says, it's basically understanding what he does there. That's important.
One question,
Sure.
continuing on this one, since in the other sect of Islam, we really don't have equivalent of Taziyeh as far as I know. At the same time, since like the Sufi Siavash well predates all the Islamic stuff, right?
Yeah.
So how do you see the connection between that and maybe and by extension, Taziyeh?
There are definitely relationships between what we know as Taziyeh today and Suy Siavash or Suveshun or other similar passion plays. And I think one of the most accepted theories is that what we had as a passion play was influenced by what was created during the Sulukian period. So they brought some of Greek kind of drama, that they had these rituals, so they were like somehow absorbed by the creators in Iran and like became a ritual in Iran too, or at least improved what we had. Going back to the history of Taziyeh, you can find all these connections. But what is important here, at least what serves the idea of this book, is how Yaghma, as a religious person, makes Taziyeh secular to basically make it political. Not only in content, but also in breaking free from the regular form, but accepted forms. So in that matter, it's not really the priority of this study to find those relationships. It's more like about what he knew as Taziyeh and how he changed it at that time, and then how it was influential on the next generation of poets. Because then you see in Nasim Shomal, he takes all these language, all these light rhythms, which is very important in the history of Persian prosody. The light rhythms that he creates and brings into his divan are very influential on the next generation of poets. And these are not regular, they are very, very light, like Tan Mardan Nishan Tiq و Tire, Mafail و Mafail و Mafail is very, very light, like basically a nursery rhyme in terms of like prosody. Or in Asar Muradiyeh, he changes the prosodic meters. So the first section that I read, نه کاروان تپس لشکر بلوچ بود مفاعلون فعلاتون مفاعلون فعلون changes to به ریش تو که خود اهل کاروان دیدم مفاعلون به ریش تو که خود اهل کاروان دیدم مفاعلون فعلاتون مفاعلون فعلون, which is very, very important in that time, that you find a way to change the rhythm. And it only is possible by incorporating this form into their poetry, because other poetic forms do not allow you. You cannot do that in Qasida or Ghazal or even Mustazad, the easier, freer forms. I hope I answered your question. I think I went off topic a little.
We have time for one last question, if you have one.
Can I ask one?
Sure.
So we talked about the history a lot. Do you see any connection to our modern history in terms of experimentation with form, connection to political events, which we don't, there is not we don't have lack of those, let's say, in the country. How do you see these two evolving into the modern day?
It's very interesting, actually, because I think after at least 2 decades of attempts to unpoliticize Persian poetry, at least during the 1990s and 2000s, poets today are returning to this kind of political discourse of poetry. By incorporating similar themes, tones, language into their poems, because they basically, especially after the Green Movement, especially after the Zan Zindagi Azadi movement, poets today try to find a way to for their poetry to work on the streets. In this poem, شعر بلند شرایط, in the section I'm making an example of myself because that's the only thing that I remember, not that I'm the one of the good ones. I say that I would not write this poem if only someone else could write something that serves what it wants to, like این شعر نخواهم نوشت اگر کسی دیگری این رو بنویسد یا اگر کسی بنویسد یک شعار دو خطی با زغال روی دیوار. So even if someone writes, say, like a chant and slogan on the wall by charcoal. So the idea is to bring this poetry again into the streets, helping people to think politically through poetry. That's one way that is necessarily influenced by the history of alternative poetry, because these are tools that you can use to achieve that. Also, there is another thing, the idea of verse essay, that I believe is a very, very prominent form these days, although it's not categorized yet as a proper form, Persian poetic form. But I believe that many of the poems created now are verse essays that are critical thinkings within the form of a poetry, within a form of a poem, that allows reader to use poetic tools to think politically. So let the poetry shape their political ideas, which is not necessarily something pragmatic. So it might not work out there in the streets, but still, that's a way of political thinking, I think. And again, this is something that we can see, the roots of it can be seen in the history of alternative Persian poetry, not the mainstream of modern semi-Iran, although it has its own values and ways of political thinking and commentary, especially on the political situation. But it's still political thinking in terms of form. I think it comes from these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.